So you did a biography on Juanita Brooks.
Correct.
Why? What led you to do something on Juanita Brooks? Tell us a story or two that would capture the essence of how remarkable you feel she might have been. And then talk about your feelings around the church's, in 2007, the church's, quote, semi-apology regarding the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It's a big topic, but I'll set you loose.
Well, in 1973, Juanita came to, she'd have been 75 then. She came to Weber State and spoke to us in the special collections room in the afternoon, and she talked, among other things, about her insistence on publishing in her biography of John D. Lee, published 11 years after her history of the Mountain Meadows Massacre had been published. She wanted to publish the fact that the church had reinstated John D. Lee.
In other words, they had excommunicated him,
Way
but
back.
posthumously.
Yeah, for his participation. In fact, he was the only person executed for participating in the massacre, and he'd been excommunicated. And her purpose in writing both those books was partly to vindicate John D. Lee, not to exonerate him from participation, but for having been singled out as the only one among about 55 prominent Mormons who were at the scene of the massacre, and a lot of others that were involved in the decision-making that weren't at the scene. Well, the church had insisted that the Lee family not make generally known the reinstatement of their ancestor. Well, when Juanita Brooks got...
Do we know why? Do we have a sense or even a guess as to why?
Well, I'm going to guess that it was because they were admitting that Brigham had driven a bargain, and he'd done a plea bargain if they focused on John D. Lee and had leave the rest of his Mormon confreres alone, then okay, and that happened, said Juanita. And I'm afraid, I think the church thought that reinstating John D. Lee might be admission that Brigham did that. That's unthinkable for a prophet to scapegoat somebody. But the Lee family were so excited, they did not, they were told if this becomes a big public issue, President McKay will rescind the reinstatement. And Juanita was summoned to the office of Stapley, Delbert Stapley, the apostle, down Temple Square, or the church office building, and he leaned on her in person not to publish that. She said she promised not to publish it in the first edition of the biography. What she didn't tell him, that there were only going to be 1,000 copies of that printed for the Lee family, and then the printer would put a new plates in and issue a new edition of it, and it would carry at the very end this announcement of the reinstatement.
So she was deceiving him a little bit?
He felt so. Now, but in arguing with him, she tried to persuade him that it was the Lord wanted that reinstatement put in there. She said, I have had unknown obstacles to publishing this biography. It's been ready, and I now believe it was the Lord's way of waiting till the reinstatement had occurred so that we can get it in. That's my testimony. And she said, she didn't identify it as Delbert Stapley. I learned that in my research.
He was an
later.
apostle, right?
He was an apostle. She said he slapped the table and said, it is of the devil. In other words, her revelation was from the...
Got trumped.
Yeah, and she said to us in that group that day at Weber State, she said, I looked him in the eye and I said, brother, in this matter I know the will of the Lord as well as you do. And I thought, well, I love that woman. That's what got me going on reading the two books for the first time, and I wrote that little essay called "The Mormon," Juanita Brooks, the Mormon Historian as Tragedian, and it's still being used in certain classes at BYU, and then the University of Utah Press asked me to write the biography on basis of that, which I eventually got around to doing. But
give our listeners a sense for the feat of doing what she did as a mother in the 50s, as a woman, against all odds, in a very conservative church.
She lived in St. George, a housewife. She was a mother of both children and stepchildren, and active in the church. And she still wrote that book, and she still researched it. And what she wrote was so well written and so well researched that it stood as the classic statement of the massacre for 50 years, and only now is being challenged for that position.
I've heard a story about how she kept her writing materials in a...
She kept her typewriter under a cloth, and she had her ironing board with damp ironing on it. And if a neighbor called, she'd cover the typewriter and be up ironing. One neighbor remarked, "You're ironing every morning, aren't you?" He says, "I didn't say this to her, but only if you only knew it. I'm only ironing while you're here." But at any rate.
And she was hiding out why?
Well, it wasn't a woman's role at St. George to be writing history. But as she got the book moved along in the late 40s, getting near, she had a lot of qualms about excommunication. She had watched her friend Fawn Brody she was keenly aware of Fawn's excommunication, and
No Man Knows My History.
Right. And she 1945, and so she feared excommunication, and I suppose she came closest to it, not then, but after doing what Delbert Stately thought was lying to him. He proposed to President McKay to excommunicate her, but there's a story I ought to tell you about that. But before I do, I later discovered in my research that Juanita was exaggerating in talking to us at the group. She told us she did what she wanted to do. In this, I know the will of the Lord as well as you do, brother. I'm convinced on other things I researched about that episode and the detail her husband Will gives in his diary at that time, things I didn't realize till I was researching for the biography. I think Juanita was one emotionally battered woman. I bet she didn't say that, but I do think she emerged from there having decided what she was going to do. She lived up to her promise, the first edition, no mention, but the second edition would follow immediately. And she would accept excommunication if that's what it took. I think she truly was closest to it. So I think she was telling us there what she would have liked to have said.
And felt.
And felt. I've learned since from some research that Greg Prince did in his biography of President McKay that Delbert Stapley recommended to President McKay that she be excommunicated, and he said simply, "Well, I'll leave her alone." And Delbert told that to a friend from Australia who turned up coincidentally at a home of a friend in Salt Lake where Juanita was that afternoon. And he told her the story about Delbert Stapley this friend told Juanita that Delbert had recommended excommunication, but that President McKay had said, "I'll leave her alone." And he said that Juanita took both his hands and tears came into her eyes. as she heard that. So she finally realized that how close she had come, but that President McKay himself, far from rescinding the rescinding the reinstatement of John D. Lee, also refused to excommunicate her.
And you have a sense that she was a sincere believer? Or?
Well, people argue that she wasn't by later in her later life, but on the whole, given the fact that people go up and down a little in their faith, I think Juanita was a believer to the end. She argued with Dale Morgan over Joseph Smith when Fawn Brody's book came out. Dale Morgan was an unbeliever. He was an agnostic. And Juanita could take Joseph Smith with all his faults and still believe he was a prophet. And as Richard Bushman shows us, that's the way you've got to do it. You see, Richard gives you all this detail that show the faults and foibles of Joseph, but Richard's a believer.
Do you see Juanita Brooks as a hero?
Oh yeah, very much for me. She's been a model for me. To me, she's a model of dissent that works, because I think the church's building of the monuments down and buying the site of the monument and building monuments on it is directly related to Juanita's work. It might have happened, but it wouldn't have happened as fast if Juanita hadn't written her book when she did. It took 50 years, 40 years at least, before that first monument appeared. I do think that people like Will Bagley ought to get off the anti-church bit. Will's big, thick book on Juanita, I think, will be very appealing to Gentile readers because it is so anti-Mormon. But I think it's trying to kick a dead horse. And the spirit of Juanita would be, well, look, let's look at the facts and then let's get over trying to keep the resentment going. Yes, I think Juanita's big message for me is you take things like the massacre and you realize that it was a tragedy for the perpetrators as well as for the victims, and you have to get to some sense of forgiveness for them and be thankful that you aren't put into the circumstances where you would be tested by that.
So one of compassion and empathy.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the attitude you should have rather than wanting to press the church's face further into the gravel, rather than realizing the church has basically made its apology for the Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Do you feel the same thing about the blacks then? That maybe the church has already apologized?
Well, yes and no. I don't know.
Different topic for you.
Church has a hard time apologizing overtly, doesn't it? Explicitly, you have to interpret it. It's still got to apologize for what it does to women and for what it does to Heavenly Mother, but that'll come.
So what do you think of the latest statements about the Mountain Meadows Massacre by the church? Is that a further apology? Is that a wonderful step forward?
It's a wonderful step forward. The fact that Richard Turley could publish that brief summary of their book in the Ensign. The beauty of that is now the rank and file church member knows that it's okay to read about and talk about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And there are a lot of topics that are still, like an article we've recently published in Dialogue, and we'll be talking about at the little Northwest Sunstone Symposium, Whither Noah's Flood can be reinterpreted as to referring, the scriptural reference to the Noah's Flood, referring to a localized regional flood rather than a global flood, which science says is impossible. So
right. If you had to this is just going to come out of left field, but if you had to summarize the lessons of Mountain Meadows, what would the lessons be for us today?
That human beings need to read into their own, read their own behavior closely enough to see how they provoke one another. I happen to believe that the massacre at Mountain Meadows had an awfully lot to do with the American public back east. America of the 1850s, it wasn't divided into sane, civilized non-Mormons and these fanatic Mormons. It was divided into groups of people, all who vilified one another. The rhetoric of anti-Mormonism that came out of the earliest existence of the church in Palmyra, and then Kirtland, and then Missouri, and then Illinois, you can see that the fanaticism that created the massacre in southern Utah was alive and well among non-Mormons in back east, and they had given the Mormons good doses of it. So that in a way, even though true, the Fancher train did not merit at all what happened to it by any civilized standard, for the men who did it, it was a blow. They were still fighting Nauvoo and Far West and the purgings from back east. I think that the problem with Will's book, Will Bagley, is he still wants to side a sane and civilized non-Mormon America against the Mormons, who even today refuse to recognize says Will, their responsibility, rather than realizing that that massacre grew out of a large, not a Mormon culture of violence only, an American culture of violence that had a lot of that's, you've got to go all the way back to there to start explaining the Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Not unlike what we're experiencing maybe today with the war.
Failing to see our own contribution to what's going on in Iraq, which ought to be very visible.
So that's not just a Mormon lesson.
No, it's a national lesson.
Human lesson. You talk a bit in your book about retrenchment on the liberal Mormon front. What's that about?
It's about the 1990s when liberal Mormonism took it in the chops, big step back, and I don't know that it's recovered.
And were you heavily involved in dialogue in Sunstone?
Oh yes, and the church denounced symposia, and everyone knew what that meant, and the Committee on Strengthening the Church distributed a lot of summonses all over the Utah area, and many Mormon writers and contributors to Dialogue and Sunstone were convoked, and the September 6th were disciplined.
How much of that did we bring on ourselves versus was versus was unjustified? In terms of using harsh rhetoric, in terms of being too strident in the criticisms, do you as a metaphor for what we just talked about, do you see it as a two-sided affair, the clamping down on intellectuals and dissenters, or do you see them as mostly victims?
Certainly they provoked it. They made choices and got the results of their choices. I think you could have been more tactful. Gene England didn't go under with the September 6th, but his slide out of favor at BYU started at that famous Sunstone meeting in which he stood up and in the camera denounced the committee on strengthening the membership.
Around what year was that?
Oh, that would have been 92, I think.
Okay. So he stood up and said, and this is the committee that was investigating dissenters and
and
keeping files on
right.
people and telling
Yeah.
stake presidents and bishops to interview
Right.
people and to start putting
Right.
pressure on them.
It was that same session that got Levina in trouble, I believe, that she wrote an article that was published, I guess, in Dialogue, and then that got her excommunicated. But at any rate, I gave a Sunstone speech in '93 urging liberal Mormons to retreat and not confront and just survive for a while and stay in the church, but those who are on the church payroll to stay on it and not lose their jobs. And I spoke to what was coming with Levina, for example, that hadn't quite happened yet. I said, those who just have to make a stand here and go out, well then at least don't abandon Mormonism, keep going. Levina did that. I'm sure it wasn't my advice. I think that's her nature, but some of the others didn't. But I said that I would. I said if I were excommunicated, I would show up next Sunday and on the back row and sleep as usual in sacrament meeting. But
Did you think were you scared that you might be?
Well, I didn't know. I wasn't very scared. However, the next spring, my stake president phoned me and very deferentially asked me if he could visit me in my office at the English department that we were staying. I was chairman of the department at that moment.
Was this for your book or for your speeches at Sunstone?
I didn't know what it was for. All I knew is that other people had been being summoned.
What do you guess it might have been for?
Well, I know. I'm going to tell you.
Okay. Sorry.
But at any rate, he was very deferential to me. He was a former student of mine, incidentally. But he came to my office, he came in, and I came out behind my desk, and I sat by facing him we each had a conference chair.
Mano a mano.
And he began asking me about my attitude toward the church, and I told him I had that I was a liberal Mormon. I certainly wasn't an anti-Mormon, and that I valued my membership in the church, and that I recognized the sovereignty of the First Presidency and the 12 and so on. And I spoke then of my heritage, coming from a long line of Mormons and a big Mormon family, and I said I valued all that, and I said I spoke of what I wrote in my essay, Christian by Yearning. I said I hoped for salvation and would be grateful for it if I were to wake up and find it was extended to me from death. And he finally told me very anticlimactically the essay he'd come in for. It was an essay in Sunstone on called A Hike to Timpanogos or something of that sort, where with family members I had gone to the summit of Timpanogos and looking down on Utah Valley, where all those babies are born hand over fist, written about what how overpopulation is fed by the great value of love. And I don't mean just sexual love, I mean love for little children. Everybody loves little children. And you got an impulse to have more of them. And you overpopulate the earth. But he didn't seem much disturbed by that. He told me that that's what had sent him in. But as he left, he was so kind and all that I realized that I was off free. That I'd passed the interview. And he was very So I didn't have a bad experience with it.
How'd you feel when the excommunications came down in September of 1993?
Well, I regretted them and wished the church could be more acceptive of a liberal contingent. Some ways the church is more liberal now than it used to be. I think its attitude on the Mountain Meadow Massacre is one evidence, but on the other hand, it seems to me that BYU as a campus is turning more and more non-scientific, insistent upon the disparity between science and faith, rather than working to show their harmony, as it ought to be doing. And I see quite a bit of evidence of that, and I regret that. It's too bad. I don't know what will happen. The liberal Mormons like the little dog barking at the freight train, remember?
Tell us about that.
That the train doesn't know the little dog's there, and the little dog's okay if it stays off the track, but the little dog's got to bark or it doesn't feel good. And that's what the liberal Mormon has to do. Has to keep telling the church, shape up. Church largely ignores it, goes its way.
So is the barking of no consequence then?
Little consequence.
And that's just something we have to
Well, you hope
accept.
It makes a difference. I put together a panel at Sunstone on early return missionaries about 4 years ago. And it was a very mixed panel of the people on it. But a reporter from Deseret News showed up. And there was a very affirmative summary of that panel in the Deseret News, which startled me a little. The Trib is usually the newspaper that publishes Sunstone. And it seemed to me the church was willing to recognize that that missions aren't for everybody. That it needs some kind of reform in the way it preaches missions for everybody and the way it treats those who come home early.
And you cite that as an example where maybe...
Might be liberalizing a little when it wants to.
So should the dog keep barking?
Yeah.
Should.
Has to.
Tell me about the importance of Sunstone dialogue in your life and the extent to which you see them both as important to the church or to its members. And I don't mean to conflate the two, but I'll start that way, and you can split them up if you want.
Well, in a sense, the Sunstone and Dialogue, and also the Association for Mormon Letters, which isn't in as bad odor as Sunstone and Dialogue, but they, as I first really came to terms with them in the early 80s, I think they kept me a Mormon. And I don't know that I would have ever withdrawn my name voluntarily from the rolls of the church. I never had any impulse to do that. But as I said, I had little sense of investment in Mormonism, little sense that there was anything for me in it. And I realized there are Mormons here who think I'm a Mormon. And in a sense, that made me one. I got my sense of having an investment in Mormonism from Gene England and Charlotte and Bruce Jorgensen and those friends Linda Silito and John, those people who were members of the first writing group that I belonged to. And the people I knew on the staffs at Sunstone and Dialogue, and I realized there is a Mormonism that I belong to. And I will say this, that to my observation, 9/10 of those people are believers. They're liberal Mormons, but they're believers. Levina's a believer. Gene was a believer. Just as fervently and sincerely as the most ardent conservative Mormon. And while I didn't pretend to have a faith of that sort, if my closest approach to faith is a hope, the hope of the Christian by yearning, the fact that there was this sizable contingent of Mormons of this sort bonded me to the church. I then had my family, the tradition and legacy of my family that bonded me, and I had a group of contemporaries to bond with. And so very important, and they need to exist, they need to continue, they need to persist. We don't want either Sunstone or Dialogue to go under. And as far as I'm concerned, the symposium is vital, even though some people say you ought to rename it the Sunstone Conference, as if that would make a difference. But whether or not, I think the outlet given by Sunstone Symposium has done immeasurable good for the church. And that the denunciation of symposia directed chiefly at the Sunstone Symposium was misbegotten. It was wrong-headed. And I think the ruling apostles of 50 years from now will have quite a different attitude about it.